Well, we just all had Thanksgiving. Hope yours was good. Sounds like John had a nice trip, so I hope some of you had a good time with your family and friends during Thanksgiving. Seems like this would be a good time to talk about the people that get celebrated one time a year, and that's it. The Puritans and Pilgrims. Otherwise, they're just forgotten people, and I don't think they should be forgotten. So I want to do something about the legacy that we owe these people. And of course, a lot of us might say, well, that's the legacy. Turkey, cranberry sauce. Kids in grade school wearing those little cone-shaped caps, that's it, once a year. But I don't think that's the case, and I wanted to share with you today something that Alex de Tocqueville said. This is a French writer. He came over to America in the 1830s, and his comments about America were so insightful that they still teach his writings today. So I teach American Lit. I have taught it in the past out of Palomar College, so I've had them read sections of de Tocqueville. So here's one thing that de Tocqueville said as he's come over the country, starting to look around and see what our society is like and all. He said, I think I can see the whole destiny of America contained in the first Puritan who landed on these shores. So for him, it was not a case of, well, okay, once a year, let's celebrate him and then let's move on. He said there's something in the American spirit, there's something in the American attitude. He said, I can still see it, even though in his time period it'd be, 200 years since they'd come. For us, it's way over 300 years. But he says, I can still see it. There's something in the American spirit. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. Maybe we can start this way, though. There's some confusion when it comes to the Puritans and the Pilgrims. I think, first of all, is the two names. We tend to kind of overlap them and get them all mixed up. And so I wanted to start there, like who were they and why they have two different names. So the Pilgrims, the ones that you think of with those hats and all at Thanksgiving, they were actually called separatists. Anybody heard that word before? You studied any church history and all? The separatists came along at a time where they did not want to tie into the official Church of England at the time. They said, it's too Catholic, it's too ritualistic, it's too much carryover of superstitions, too much popery, or whatever they would call it. They say too much of the old stuff. We've broken off. We're Protestants now. And so they said, let's separate. Well, that didn't go over big. We'll talk about the history in a minute. But that's the Pilgrims. They were the separatists. They're the ones that if you ever see or picture in your mind people in dark clothing, it's the Pilgrims. They're from the lower classes, didn't have much money. We know that's the case because take a look at the ships that they tried to come over in. First it was the Mayflower and another ship called the Speedwell, which is a joke of a name. The ship, it's an amazing story. Sometimes if you can just read about the Pilgrims, it's something else. But they came over in this ship called the Speedwell. They got about a day or two out of England. That thing was just a leaky sieve. And they knew they weren't going to make it in that ship. And they ended up having to go back to England. Everybody got off the Speedwell. They got on the Mayflower, so it kind of filled it up and they came over to America. But they didn't have much money. And the only way they could come over was basically to sell everything that they had, and then when they came to America, the promise was we're going to send all the crops back and anything we can to pay off these debts. So it was a real hard scrabble existence for those people. The Puritans, on the other hand, were not separatists. Look at the name, Puritan, purify. They said, yeah, we don't like the way the Church of England is going. We don't like the rituals and all these other things. But they said, we think we can change it from within. So they were going to purify the church, became called Puritans. They're actually in really colorful outfits. If you read about them, they're amazing. They loved to give toys to their kids. They were not somber. They were not dark people. They were from the upper and middle classes. For example, John Winthrop, you heard of him. He was the leader of the Puritans, the first group that came over. He was a lawyer. Don't hold that against him, but I mean, he was a lawyer. And these are people that had some money behind them. And so when they came over, they had the money to make sure their plantation came out okay. So eventually, as the years go by, the Plymouth plantation under the Pilgrims just got by. That's all it did. It just sort of survived. The Pilgrims, the Puritans had people coming, they had money coming for them. Their group, their colony really grew, and finally by, I think it was 1690 or so, they just sort of absorbed the Pilgrims. So the Puritans kind of took over the whole thing. So that's the difference between the two groups. Let's talk about some unfair stereotypes of these groups. I'll tell you why in a minute, but there's been some unfair stereotyping that's gone on. For example, I love the dictionary definition. What's a Puritan, according to the dictionary? One who regards pleasure as sinful. We'll come back to that, but isn't that interesting? Having a good time is a bad idea, at least according to this dictionary definition. And then somebody made a joke about that, and they came up with, this is not from the dictionary, this is just a comment, I love it. It's not fair, but it is funny. A Puritan is someone who's afraid that somewhere someone is having a good time. We've got to stop that. That's terrible. Quit laughing. What are some of the associations people have? Again, they picture them all walking around in these dark-colored clothes, sexually repressed people. By the way, none of these things are true about the Puritans. They're not sexually repressed. They thought sex was expressed within marriage, outside of marriage, bad idea, in marriage, wonderful. I taught the class, and so we'd come across letters that they would write to each other, husbands and wives. They were pretty hot. They thought sex was a pretty good thing, and I'm anxious to have you come back, wherever they'd gone. Anti-science, that's another part of it. Oh, these people were superstitious. They're anti-science. So we're going to come across that a little bit later today. I'll show you why that's not the case. Uneducated. These are the barbarians of the time period. All the educated people are in the Church of England. These are the outcasts. These are the dregs of society. Not true. None of these things are true. That they were authoritarian. That they didn't believe in democracy. It was all, two or three high-ups, maybe the church leader or something, that was all about that. And very grim people. Nothing funny about them at all. None of these things are true. And I've always wondered, how did this all get started? I'll tell you why I think it got started. I just don't know when it got started. But these are the views that people have today. I'll tell you I'm going to blame one person, which is odd for me because I teach literature, but I blame Nathaniel Hawthorne, partially. Did anybody get subjected to, and I use that term carefully, did you get subjected to reading the Scarlet Letter when you were in school? Some of you did. That used to be, I taught high school for years, that used to be the 10th grade book. Everybody had to read the Scarlet Letter. And I love literature, but good grief. The Scarlet Letter for 10th grade kids, it's all about sin and redemption and inner turmoil and how things can eat at you and ruin your life. And you think, 10th graders, they're dealing with a lot of other things, football games or whatever. It's kind of hard to make those connections, with the Scarlet Letter. But here's what Hawthorne had to say in the Scarlet Letter. First, he's got a part that's the preface before you actually start the story. So the first two quotes up here are from, here we go. The first two quotes are from his intro. So this is him talking about his family, which is true. He had two ancestors that go way back to the Puritan days. So he said this, that first ancestor still haunts me. Grave, bearded, sable-cloaked with his Bible and his sword. He was a bitter persecutor. That's quite an image, isn't it? Quite a picture of this person. He calls them these stern and black-browed Puritans. It's a nice line. But to hear that same image being created for us today, these grim people, they're all wearing dark clothes. And then the last quote up here I like a lot because I think he's done a good job. I don't think it's fair, but I think he's done a good job creating the setting for the story. In the lit class, we talk about how important setting is. Most people just say, okay, you set it here, okay, you put the story here. But many authors use the setting to give you a feeling, give you a mood, give you a peek into a culture that maybe you're not familiar with. And I think Hawthorne does the same thing. These are the opening words of the actual start of the Scarlet Letter itself. So here's what he says. A throng of bearded men in sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats, intermixed with women, was assembled in front of a wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. Is there anything in there, any phrase or any image, picture that you have that kind of illustrates this whole attitude toward the Puritans?
Like weak and judgmental.
Judgmental? Yeah. In fact, you find out soon enough they're there waiting to greet this woman who's coming out, and she's the one that's going to carry the scarlet A for adultery because she's had a child out of wedlock. Yeah, so judgmental. Anything else in here that gives you a picture, some kind of image that you say, wow, that's pretty negative?
Sad-colored garments.
Yeah, I mean, he tells you they're sad-colored, so nothing bright.
The door, the heavily timbered.
spikes makes it sounds like immovable and just totally set, no flexibility, no understanding, just arch.
Yeah, no warmth there at all. A door heavily timbered. This is a defensive door, isn't it? This is a door that's going to withstand anything. This is a door that does not have any warmth to it. There's no glass in there. There's no pretty ornamentation on the door. It's timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. This is a painful door. It's a great way to start a story, but again, I think it's pretty unfair to the Puritan people. So my question is, and I'd like you to think about that, maybe talk about it for a minute. Why do we get all these unfair pictures? Again, I don't know. I can't go back. I don't know when these first started. I don't think there's a conspiracy. But I think there's an attitude going on in the last 50 years, 75 years in America, and I would call it an anti-Christian attitude. And I think you can also blame another illustration here, and that's what's gone on with historians talking about the Middle Ages. Have you heard that term, the Dark Ages? I heard that growing up. Well, there were the Dark Ages, and then finally we outgrew them, basically. Well, you know what was going on during the Dark Ages? That was when the Catholic Church was running things pretty well. So 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, something along there. And the story goes, this is the story, not the truth, this is the way the story goes. And then, after the Dark Ages comes the Enlightenment, right? You picture that, light, dark, we come out of the darkness, we have the Enlightenment. Why is that an enlightenment? Because people are getting away from the church, they're getting away from Christianity. And people now have the boldness and they now have the freedom to throw off the shackles of religion. So that's the story. It's absolutely not true. If you don't carry away anything else from this class, the Dark Ages are no such thing. Historians have actually tossed that term. They don't even use it anymore. But it's out in society. And I think it did the same thing here with the Puritans. I think there's an anti-Christian bias, and I don't want to act real paranoid or anything, but does that make sense that in the last years, if you can put down the early Puritans and the Pilgrims, then you're trying to give Christianity itself a black eye. Does that make sense? I've seen that in discussion of missionaries. I used to think, what a wonderful thing to be a missionary. Go out and sacrifice yourself for other people. Well, take a look sometime. Go on some websites and find out what atheists and those who don't agree. They don't just say, well, good for the missionaries. They say, no, missionaries are harming the cultures they go out to. I have a whole talk about these unfair pictures of Christianity. And that's one of them, that missionaries are no good. So we're starting to hear a lot of these attacks. It used to be, well, Christianity isn't true. Jesus didn't really do this. You can't trust the Gospels. Now, you know what the new attack is? Christianity is bad. So get ready for those kinds of arguments. When you're out there talking to your friends and co-workers, they're probably not going to bring up things like, well, I don't know if the Gospels were really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're going to say things instead about how Gospels have repressed women, how Gospels are not environmentally sound. I mean, on and on and on. You're going to hear those kinds of attacks. That's what we're getting with this Puritan thing. This is just one edge of a whole lot of attacks that are going on. So just something to think about. Let's do a little background first, and then I want to spend the majority of the time today talking about what we really get from the Puritans, what is the legacy of these early people. You probably know this, but just give me a couple minutes on it just to sort of get us all together on this. You had the Protestant Reformation, and the three big names from that would be Luther and Calvin and Knox. Now, two of them are pretty well known. I would say probably Luther and Calvin are the best known, but anybody know anything about John Knox? What did he get going? What part of Protestantism is he responsible for?
The Covenanters in Scotland?
Yeah, he's in Scotland. He starts the Presbyterian movement today, that we have today, the Presbyterian Church. So he's responsible for that. Calvin was in Switzerland a lot, and of course, you heard of Calvinism. There's the 5 points of Calvinism and on and on. So, he was a big deal. Of course, Luther's the guy that got the whole thing rolling with those theses that he nailed to the door. And he happened to come along just after the printing press was good, so those ideas, man, they went out everywhere really fast. And all of a sudden, all of Europe was aflame with this Protestantism. And again, you look at the root word there, protest. And there were a lot of things that he was protesting. Probably the biggest were these indulgences. You heard about those indulgences? You could pay to get yourself out of purgatory for a period of time. It was a real scam. So no wonder there were a lot of terrible things going on in the church at the time. So along come the Protestants. The flame is lit. In England, Henry is king, and he wants to cut himself off from the church in Rome because he wants to remarry, and you know the whole story, and he establishes the Church of England, as if that's sort of a halfway point. Well, it was sort of a halfway point, but it wasn't enough for real hardcore Protestants. They said, you haven't gone far enough. So then you get the groups like the Separatists, the Pilgrims. They come along and they say that's not enough. They're persecuted like crazy in England, losing jobs, sometimes losing their lives. They go to Holland. That's where they go first. They don't come to America first. They go to Holland because Holland has more religious freedom. And they're hoping that, well, things will be better there. So they try it. They're there for a few years and they're actually flourishing. But the problem is the Dutch around them are not particularly religious people. And so the Pilgrims are seeing their kids and their family members being swayed by that society around them. So they're not being persecuted, but they're being pulled away from the Christian faith in that society. So they finally say, that's it, let's go off to America. And so the Mayflower, 1620, brings these people to America. Can you imagine at this time, if you've ever gone on a sea voyage, 2 months at sea in crummy little boats? You ever seen the Mayflower? They have a replica called the Mayflower too. By the way, I just saw something where they're going to do a refurbishing. That thing is like a 50-year-old vessel. It's sitting on the East Coast someplace, and they're redoing it because millions of Americans want to go see. It's probably the most visited ship in the world. What was it like for those people? And all you have to do is walk downstairs. I haven't been on it, but I've just seen pictures. But all you have to do is go downstairs and imagine those people sitting in the dark with the bilge water underneath, and some people probably violently ill, and poor bathroom facilities, needless to say. And on that thing for 2 months at sea. Good luck. Waves coming, storms coming, and they sat on that thing for 2 months. These people were pretty gutsy. That's pretty tough individuals to survive something like that. I wanted to share with you a reaction from a man named William Bradford. And somebody in here, where's the person I was talking to about? Okay. She can trace her family back, apparently, to the time of Bradford. Bradford was the first governor of the Pilgrims who came over here at Plymouth Plantation. I always think, what an amazing person he must have been. When he came over, when he first landed, he was 30 years old. The next year, the previous governor died, and the people elected him. Can you imagine a 31-year-old responsible for about 100 people who are in a totally alien environment? And when you got elected as governor, you weren't just governor. You didn't sit behind a desk all day. You were a judge. You were the jury for trials. You took care of the agriculture. You took care of the economics to make sure your area was sending the money back like you were supposed to England and things. I mean, it's just a huge job. And it lands on this 31-year-old guy. He must have been pretty remarkable, wouldn't you think, to handle that? So Bradford, because he was in a position of authority, wrote years and years and years of the history of these people. He was governor for 35 years till his death. So he not only did a good job taking over, they trusted him year after year after year after year. And so what a life. So he had this thing called On Plymouth Plantation. That was his memoirs about what it was like to be at this in this society. I just found out the other day, kind of interesting. The original documents, people had copied over portions of it, but the original documents disappeared during the Revolutionary War. And it showed up in England. They found them later. I always wonder whether the English, out of spite, took them off to England, or somebody's trying to keep them safe. So anyway, they're back in this country. But we have his original manuscripts that he wrote about this life. So here's from the first part of his manuscript. He's trying to describe what it's like for these people as they step off the boat and they look out. And again, there's no way we can recreate that feeling, but I hope this gives you kind of a general idea of what these people were facing. He said they had no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. I don't know what that would be like today. You're someplace totally alien, totally different. It's you or you don't survive. Who are you going to call for help? There's nobody there. What could they see, he says, but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? Well, we have a different attitude today toward the Native Americans, but again, can you imagine if you're from one culture and this other culture is, again, it's a totally alien culture, and you're trying to deal with these people. And notice the time period when they come, they've because of this, taken their ship back, and they got this late start. Now they've come over time of gales, time of sea storms, so they get past that. Now they're in the deep fall, and they land. He says, summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. They don't know the plants, they don't know the animals, they don't know the people, they don't know how to survive. Talk about ultimate faith. They thought God led them there. And they've got all these stripes against them. I love that passage, just imagining what that would have felt like. What about the first Thanksgiving? So they're over here in this country. We only have 2 sources, which I think is interesting. Out of all these people that sat there for the first Thanksgiving, it'd be kind of nice if you could recreate it and see exactly what went on. But we have to do a little bit of guesswork. But there was a letter, and there's another source of it. So I just wanted to let you hear what was going on. According to this letter, somebody wrote to a friend back in England. So this is from an American colonist writing back. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men fowling. That means taking guns out to do some hunting, so that we might rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. At which time many of the Indians came amongst us, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. I don't know about you, but did you have any family members after a couple of hours you're okay with them leaving for Thanksgiving? So the Indians come, it's like, boom, they're there. 3 days. You better keep them happy, keep them full. But they helped out. So they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time for us, yet by the goodness of God, there we go back to God again, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. So there's an appreciation for what God's provided. There's the first Thanksgiving. Not a lot of information about what they actually ate. Probably wasn't turkey. You can see deer and things like that. Okay, let's talk about the legacy then. Did you all get an outline there, I think, of the tables? All right. So we're going to look at 6 things that we can thank the Pilgrims for and the Puritans. Because I think de Tocqueville was right. There's something that has come down to us today, and it's not just the food at Thanksgiving that we can appreciate. And I think you'll look at that list and you'll say, wow, this is America. This is what's important today. 300 plus years since they were here, it's still America owing something to the roots of these people that were here before us. So number 1 is education. You look at San Diego County, we got a UC, we've got Cal States, that's at San Marcos and down at San Diego State, a lot of community colleges. In fact, about 6 or 7 years ago, thank you all very much, but you voted for a tax increase for Palomar College. And Palomar is just booming. I don't know if you've seen what Palomar has done. At one time, it was all like 1-story buildings, and they kind of ran out of space to put 1 story. So now they're going back, and now they're going up. And so there are these multi-story buildings at Palomar, starting to look like an actual college campus rather than a glorified high school. So that was like $700 million bond issue, and the state kicked in another $200 or $300 million. So there's something like almost $1 billion that's going to be spent and is being spent right now out of Palomar College. That's just one school. It's just one representative. We've always been big on education. We think it's hugely important to have a literate society. Well, a lot of people today, the secularists, say, well, I don't know, Washington Post had an article and they called Christians basically they're less educated. And that person had to withdraw that comment because that's not proof at all. That it's actually the other way around. Christians are better educated. And this is starting back, even before the Pilgrims and the Puritans, it's always been a Christian concern to educate people. Did you know, for example, in the Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages, in the Middle Ages, universities got started. Guess who started them? Christians. The biggest, most famous universities across Europe were started by Christians. Right here in the United States, if you look at this comment from Harvard University. What irony. Harvard, probably a hotbed of radical atheism now, but there's a stone there, and it's engraved at Harvard that says, These are the Puritans that wrote this. After God carried us to New England and we had built our houses, provided necessities for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, right? So there are the things they needed to do, and settled the civil government. One of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity. So think about those famous Ivy League schools, Princeton and Yale and Harvard. They all got started by Christians. And now they have to the people back there want to sort of suppress that so nobody knows about it. Now they're just bastions of liberal thinking. But they all got started because of Christian influence, by Christians actually taking the time to set these things up. So one, education. How about number two? This is that thing I told you a little bit earlier. I said, don't buy into the idea that Christianity, and especially the Puritans and Pilgrims, are anti-science. That's not true at all. In fact, if you go back far enough, the Judeo-Christian worldview is responsible for modern science. So this is another takeaway. There's never been this clash that people want to tell you between science and Christianity. That science hates, that Christianity hates science. It always tries to put scientists down. Absolutely not. But we get stories. Let me give you a couple of examples. They redid the Cosmos series. That was the old one with Carl Sagan. I don't know if you saw the old version back in the 70s. He was the science populator. And so he passed away. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, maybe you've seen him on different talk shows and all, he's filmed a brand new Cosmos series. And they take these wonderful trips out in space and they show you the universe. And I don't have any problem with that. I love that stuff. I'm a fan of science. But in the very first episode, they spent something like a quarter or a third of their time telling you a story about a guy named Giordano Bruno. Bruno lived in the 1500s. The way they spun the story on Cosmos is that Bruno made some comments about how big the universe was. That it was probably bigger than we expected. And the Catholic Church didn't want that because they didn't like science. Remember, that's the story. They don't like science. So they told him, shut up. And he kept talking about how big the universe was, and they put him to death. And he was a martyr to science. That's the story that's out there. And that's what Cosmos does. Take a look. I think you can go online and you can do YouTube and look at that first episode. It's just cartoony as all get out. They make the Catholic ones who are in charge look like ghouls. I mean, they have them really dark with their faces kind of shadowed. And Giordano Bruno's this poor guy. The story is completely different. Sometime I'll do the whole story of Christianity and how it's been twisted over the years, but he was not a martyr to science. He was a heretic. He flouted every rule of the church and said they were all wrong. And does that make it right for them to put him to death? No. I'm not saying that. But Cosmos twisted it to say Christianity is anti-science. We get the story of Galileo. What happened to Galileo? Well, he challenged the science of the church and he got tortured and got imprisoned. You could hear the chains clanking. Okay, none of that's true. But I won't get into that today. I'm just telling you, these are the stories that are out there. How about the Scopes monkey trial? Back in the 20s down in Tennessee. What was the outcome? What did the newspapers carry away from that? A guy named Mencken was a journalist. What did he carry away from that to tell everybody? That the Christians were local, stupid yahoos. And they didn't believe in evolution. Come on, get with the program. Well, that means you're anti-science. So those are the stories that are out there. Christianity is anti-science. And you get story after story of this. Well, is that true? No, modern science came from the Judeo-Christian perspective. Let's go back. Think about what happens in Genesis. It says God created. And it walks through his creation. It looks very logical. It looks very orderly. It looks a lot like master engineering. And then God takes the human race and implants some of that reasoning power into the human race. He says the world is good. He says God is not in the world. He's not growing in a tree. He's not in the cloud. He's not in the blade of grass. So you put all that stuff together. Now you're a person that's kind of curious about the world. Well, wouldn't you have the confidence that you have reasoning power that God gave you to go out and actually explore things and make sense out of the world? Yeah. Wouldn't it be okay to cut a tree down to look at something because you're not hurting God? God's not in the world. He's separate from the world. Okay. The world is good. It's not an illusion. Some places in the East, like Hinduism and all, say the world is Maya. It's just an illusion. So why would you go out and investigate an illusion? That doesn't make any sense. So all these things come together, and they create the ability for people to go out with confidence, the early scientists, and explore and come up with hypotheses and test those hypotheses. Kepler and Galileo, yes, Galileo, and Copernicus, all these people were out and out devout Christians, no doubt about it. In fact, Kepler, I like what he said. He said, when I do my science, he said, all I'm doing is thinking God's thoughts after him. Isn't that a nice way to think about that? He's just out there trying to say, how did God do this? Isaac Newton, same thing. How did God do this? So there's no anti-science going on there. So especially when we're talking about the Puritans and Pilgrims, they're part of the Reformation. It rejected the superstitions of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, unfortunately, did hang on to some scientific superstitions. And so the Puritans and Pilgrims especially wanted to blow all that stuff away. They're the ones who started the Royal Society in England. That's the most famous scientific society of its time. Guys like Edmund Halley with the Comet and Newton and people like that, they were part of the Royal Society. It was founded by Calvinists. They were not anti-science. This is an unfair charge. How about number 3? Our economics, our free enterprise system is thanks to the Protestants. And so some people will say, well, the U.S. just got fortunate. It wasn't anything about our system. It was just we're sitting on a bunch of natural resources. Well, that's not true at all. First of all, it was John Calvin who said it's okay to charge interest. Isn't that part of how you get a free enterprise system going? You need money to get things started. If you want to build a ship, if you want to start a trade, you want to do something, you need to borrow money. And so for the first time, there was the Protestants who said it's okay to charge interest. It's not usury. It's not unfair. You can go ahead and charge interest. That was the start of the foundational part of the free enterprise system. A great little economic lesson. We're back to Bradford one more time. When he came over with his colonists, they were told they were supposed to work the land together and send all that money off to England as part of what was called the mercantile system, mercantilism. So they did. They just took all the land. They said, okay, this is our land. This is the part we're going to farm. Everybody out at 8 a.m., go to work, raise those crops. Let's bring them all in together. It was a communal system. It was basically real early communism. Guess what? They didn't do well at all. It was terrible. The land didn't produce. They weren't too eager. It's been tried so many times. You get these little high-minded groups that get together and they form a little commune and go off. Hawthorne. I just mentioned Hawthorne a little while ago. He went to a place called Brook Farm. And he and a bunch of others, high-minded intellects, went off and they formed this farm. And they were going to think great thoughts together. They'd get together in the evening and share ideas for what they were writing and all. Well, somebody had to work the farm, and none of them wanted to do that. And the thing just went, fell apart in a few weeks. So here it is again. Bradford says, I don't like this system. They went to private ownership. And guess what? Are you surprised? Here's what Bradford said. This is after they came up with the private enterprise idea. They began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could. They should set corn every man for his own particular, and in that regard, trust to themselves. Isn't that part of the free enterprise system? Trust to yourself, rather than government, rather to some kind of state intervention. Trust to yourself. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious. So all of a sudden now, that's your land, your family's, that's your land, that's a different family, that's a different family's land over there. Whatever you get, it's yours, go to it. And they did, and they worked like crazy. And Bradford's conclusion, I thought, made a lot of sense. By adopting the communal system, we thought we were wiser than God. So he said, not a good idea. As a conclusion to this, somebody once said, when everyone is entitled to everything, no one is responsible for anything. Is that a good line? Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth today because America is changing, and I'm not going to say good or bad. I'll just leave that up to you with your politics. But I think we're seeing more state-run things, more big government trying to do things, and this seems to fly in the face of that. How about number 4? Here's something else we can thank the Puritans and Pilgrims for. Look at the title, Protestant Work Ethic. Now, critics are going to say, well, all they were doing, they were just working hard trying to make God like them. But that's not true. What was going on was, before we got the Protestant Revolution, go back to the Middle Ages and so on, the idea was, let's separate from the world. The world is an icky place. The world is a dark place. The world is full of evil and all. Let's go into our monasteries. Let's retreat from the world. Let's become monks. That was a real high ideal. Let's become monks. But John Calvin, notice how many times Calvin pops up in this thing. But Calvin says, wait, work is good. Work's the way you honor God. Work's the way you show God that you appreciate what He's done for you. There's something ennobling about work. We're called not out of the world, we're called into the world. In fact, okay, I said I wasn't going to get real political here, but do you remember when the decision came down regarding same-sex marriage? A lot of Christians said, that's it, society's done for. Basically, let's go to the hills. Let's separate and have kind of like Christian enclaves, not physically, but just let's give up on things. But that's not what Calvin's saying. I hope you don't feel that that's the way to honor God, is to walk away from the society and let it crumble. Calvin says, get out there, make a difference. We're called into the world, and all work is honorable. Well, that's part of the Protestant work ethic. Number 5, how about charity? America is an extremely big-hearted nation, isn't it? What's the first thing you hear of when there's a calamity around the world, a tsunami here, an earthquake there? Who's packing up the airplanes? Americans. I don't know the last time I've ever heard, the Saudis are filling up airplanes full of supplies to fly them into areas that have a disaster. It's always the Americans, the National Guard or whatever. We're sending out and trying to help people all over the place. Recently there was a study by the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It's not a Christian organization. And they did a study, and they said, the more important religion is to a person, the more likely that person is to give to a charity of any kind, not just religious. See, that's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear, well, yeah, Americans give a lot, but they're religious and they just give to religious things. That's not true. According to this organization, they give to any kind of charity. Americans are big-hearted, thanks to the Puritans. In fact, I just got some statistics together which are pretty interesting. Nearly $400 billion in 2015 was given to charity. And you think, well, yeah, but there's all these big corporations out there. They're probably doing it all. No. The statistics say 70% of that money came from us, from just individuals who cared. The average household gave nearly $3,000 in this country. Let me ask you, let me take just a second on that. So charity. In our apologetics group, there's a guy named Dan who's really involved with the homeless. And he is doing things all the time with the homeless in Escondido. What are some other organizations you're aware of, maybe you're part of, or you give to them, or you feel like they've done some good things that are probably coming from a good Christian background? Any groups that you think of?
Well, smaller groups like going to Angel Tree.
Yeah, the Angel Tree, right. Wasn't that started by Franklin Graham, or is that somebody else? Was it Chuck Colson?
Chuck Colson.
Chuck Colson, yeah, Angel Tree. And the whole prison fellowship thing that he did.
Yeah,
that's a tragic loss. I'm so sorry to see Chuck pass away a while back. Yeah, he's working with the least of our society, the ones we want to just lock up and forget. And he would go into these prisons. These guys were so hungry for spiritual things, they'd come up to him. Yeah, that's a good example. What are some others?
World Vision.
World Vision. They're all over the world, sponsoring kids that either have families that don't have money, or they take care of orphan kids and try to bring them along in a good way. Sure. Yeah.
Rescue Mission down in
San Diego Rescue Mission.
Alternatives.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Alternatives for the pregnancy.
Lady Salvation Army.
Salvation Army started as a Christian organization. That's a great story, by the way. A guy named William Booth in England. How we got that going. There's soup kitchens. There, right here we have literacy that Hector works with called The Bridge. He works with people, the Hispanic community, and tries to help their kids stay in school and succeed. So all these things are out there. Emmanuel Faith does this day of work for schools, and I mean, this is a really giving church anyway. And so you hear all these wonderful things, just lifts your heart. And it's because the Christian view is we need to give. We need to help our brothers and sisters. Winthrop talked about that one in the 1600s. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. In all meekness, gentleness, patience, we must make each other's conditions our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. But I love that phrase. We must make each other's conditions our own. I think Christians do that. They step into that world of unhappiness. They step into that world of prison, whatever it is, to say, you need to hear this. Is good information for you.
It's kind of interesting, that point, because we live in a post-communist country, or communist country, and when you're talking about how they're individualistic in terms of the economics, and yet as a church we're called to be kind of like a commune in a sense of coming together. But I think this illustrates it beautifully, that it's, we come together, we make each other's problems our own. If someone else is struggling, we're going to help them.
Yeah.
We're going to sell what we have and, to bless other people. But yet there's still that separation in each person doing their own work as well. So it's
there's a tension there, isn't there? Yeah. There's always been a tension in America. Think about the human race. We would say as Christians that basically we're twisted. There's something wrong with all of us. And that's part of the reason the free enterprise system works so well, doesn't it? Because you're looking for your self-interest, which may or may not be a great self-interest, but it works by releasing that attitude out there. Communism says, we'll do it for you and we'll all work together. Well, that's not the way the human race works. We don't want that. We don't want to help somebody else that badly if we're not Christian. We want to scoop it up for ourselves. So there is that tension that goes on. But I like that. We must make each other's conditions our own. Here's the last one, number 6, democracy. Now, are there other things that we could have talked about? Yes, but it's just a matter of time. I think there are a lot of things that the Puritans and Pilgrims embodied that are part of our society today that are good things. So don't feel like these are the only 6, but it's just because of time. So number 6, there's a pretty big one, democracy. These people were as involved as they could be in England. They signed something called the Mayflower Compact. I want to show you that in a couple of minutes. I won't take too long on that right now. But once they got to America, it was all about self-governance. It was not just a top-down authoritarian kind of thing. They had town meetings where everybody got input when towns were small. That must have been pretty cool. The states would start setting up bills of rights. I'm making that plural because each society would have their own bill of rights that they believed were important. The American Revolution, I didn't know this until just a few years ago. The American Revolution in England was often called the Presbyterian Revolution. Why? Because the church people, the Presbyterians, so often got behind this revolution and stirred the people up and went to the locals and the pastors in these different communities would talk about the importance of these rights that have been trampled on by the British. And in fact, the statistics are pretty astounding here. 80% of Washington's officers were Presbyterians. That's Reformation people. 50% of the army was Presbyterian. That's Pilgrim Puritan background. Again, that's the Reformation. That's the Protestant outlook on things. The Founding Fathers, you probably were aware of this, but the Founding Fathers, yes, they cited different people for some of their ideas, but the most cited source of their inspiration and their information and their way of doing things was from the Bible. That's just flat out true. You can go through and do all this document study if you care to. So let's go back to the Mayflower Compact. I wanted to show you something here. I know you can't see it very well from where you are. This, unfortunately, the original got, I don't know what happened, whether it burned up or just wore out or something. So they made copies. This is just a copy. But I wanted to show you something here, which I think is kind of cool. Down on this side, these are the people that signed it. And if you look closely, and you can just go online to get a copy of this, you'll see William Bradford's name, you'll see Miles Standish's name, and you'll see John Alden's name. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. I'm always blown away when I actually see something that was written by somebody that I've heard of before, famous in history. Sharon and I one time went up to the Huntington Museum, and they have actually Ben Franklin's autobiography. And I was staring at that thing. I said, Ben Franklin sat with these sheets of paper and actually so you can see his handwriting. It's like, wow. So I don't know if that's just me, but there's Bradford and there's Alden and there's Standish who signed this thing among them. the others that you can see there. So what's so big about this Mayflower Compact? Well, let me just read a portion of it. I underlined, it was not underlined in the original, but I underlined some key words that I thought were pretty important. We whose names are underwritten do solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic, and to enact, constitute, and frame just and equal laws, and unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. All right, why did they do this, first of all? They were given a grant to go to Virginia. So they're in the boat, and in those 2 months they had rough seas and they had storms, and it blew them up to Cape Cod. That's where they landed, Cape Cod. Well, they're way off from Virginia, so now they're kind of in uncharted territory. Their charter doesn't count anymore. That's not what they were given to do by the people back in England, so now they're kind of like starting from square one. So they said, we need to kind of start everything all over again, and they wrote this thing out. So I wanted to hit a few of the key words there. They said, we're doing this in the presence of God. This is not a godless document. Now, why am I pointing that out? Because later on you're going to get people that say, well, the Constitution doesn't mention God, so therefore it's a secular, godless document. No, it's not. The Constitution traces its way back to state constitutions. The state constitutions go back to the Mayflower Compact. So this compact was the basis for state constitutions, eventually the United States Constitution. So it's in the presence of God, and they use that word covenant. Have you heard that term covenant from a Christian perspective? What's a covenant? It's an agreement. It's a contract. And there was the Mosaic covenant, there's the Davidic covenant, there's the Abrahamic covenant. So you had these covenants in the Old Testament. They were solemn, they were important, carefully thought out things between God and people. You do this and I do this and this will happen, otherwise bad things will happen. They're doing a covenant as well, and they're not just coming up with that word out of the blue. They saw this, especially since they're talking about God being involved, they saw this as a holy, religious kind of document that they're putting together. But notice they said we're going to get together in a civil body. So God and the civil, apparently it's okay to mix the two. Aren't you hearing today it's separation of church and state? It's not in the Constitution. A lot of people think it's in the Constitution. It was a private letter that Jefferson wrote. Had nothing to do, but people have latched onto that and said, don't bring religion in. Well, they've done it all the way back to the Mayflower Compact. Religion was always considered to be part of your government. So it's a civil government, and it says we promise all due submission. The day after the election, this last election, I went into my classes and I said, I don't know who you voted for. But I said, isn't that remarkable? We get angry at each other and we sling terms and words around. We write these letters and say these things. But when the election is over, does anybody grab an AK-47 and go out to the hills and start a guerrilla warfare? It hasn't happened. We had the Civil War. But, generally for elections, people say, okay, I don't like it, but I lost. And we submit. Isn't that a great thing? It doesn't happen around the whole world. This is a great system that we live in today. We got half the United States is unhappy right now, but they're not. They're going to submit. Yeah, that's what you do in America, and it is here back in the Mayflower Compact. So, what's the summary? 6 things, and I think there are more than those, but education, science, free enterprise, work ethic, charity, democracy. That is a pretty good record, don't you think? To come out of these Puritans and Pilgrims. So, resources. If you're interested in any resources, if you want the complete notes, you want to see what these quotes look like or anything, let me know. I'll just email me. It's Gary@apologeticsforlife.org. I'll send you whatever you'd like. 4 places you might go for further information if you find this interesting at all. One is David Barton. Some of you heard of David Barton? He's been part of, So he's been part of this group called Wall Builders for a long, long time. He collects and he studies early American documents. And so he's the guy to go to if you have questions about the First Amendment, you have questions about the Constitution or anything like that. Just an amazing source, wallbuilders.com. 3 books that you might like. One's called What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? That talks about the things that Jesus brought to society because of his life. One's called Under the Influence. Again, what did Christianity do to improve the society? And Schmidt covers more than I was able to cover today. And the last one is a book by actually two guys. One's named Carol. It's called Christianity on Trial. And he's saying, today Christianity is being attacked for all these different things that we were talking about, anti-science, anti-woman. So he takes the truth and he lets you go through those chapters and understand the truth behind those attacks today.